Today, we are going to analyze the decision of the United States to end the waiver related to Russian seaborne oil and the broader implications of this move for India. At first glance, this may appear to be simply another chapter in the ongoing sanctions battle linked to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. However, if we examine the issue more carefully, we realize that it reflects something much larger and far more structural. It reveals the increasing fragility of the global energy system, where sanctions, wars, supply chain disruptions, shipping insecurity, and geopolitical rivalries are becoming deeply interconnected. For a country like India, which is heavily dependent on imported energy, such developments are not distant geopolitical events. They directly influence inflation, economic growth, industrial production, fiscal stability, transportation costs, and ultimately the everyday lives of citizens. Therefore, energy security today is no longer merely a technical issue of fuel availability. It has become a central pillar of national security and economic resilience. To understand why India cannot ignore sanctions on Russian energy, we must first appreciate the nature of India's energy dependence. India imports nearly 90% of its crude oil requirements. Simultaneously, it remains one of the world's fastest-growing energy consumers. Rapid industrialization, expanding urbanization, rising transportation demands, and economic growth continuously increase India's energy needs. Unlike many developed countries where energy demand has either stabilized or is growing slowly, India's consumption is expected to continue expanding for several decades. This creates a unique challenge. India requires massive and stable energy supplies to sustain economic growth and developmental ambitions. Any disruption in global oil markets therefore affects India much more severely than countries with lower dependence on imported crude. It is in this context that Russian oil became critically important after 2022. Following Western sanctions on Russia due to the Ukraine conflict, Russian crude began entering global markets at discounted prices. India emerged as one of the major buyers of this oil. From India's perspective, this was not simply a geopolitical choice. It was primarily an economic necessity. Russian crude acted as an economic stabilizer for India during a period of extraordinary volatility in global energy markets. It helped reduce fuel price pressures at a time when crude prices were fluctuating sharply. It improved refinery economics because Indian refiners could access discounted supplies. Most importantly, it diversified India's import basket and reduced excessive dependence on any single geographical region. This diversification is extremely important in energy security strategy. Countries that depend excessively on one supplier or one region become highly vulnerable to geopolitical shocks. By purchasing Russian oil, India increased its flexibility and reduced concentration risks. Now, let us understand why affordable energy matters so deeply for developing economies like India. In advanced economies, rising fuel prices may primarily affect consumer convenience or industrial margins. But in developing economies, energy prices have far wider social and economic consequences. Rising crude prices increase transportation costs, which in turn affect food prices and overall inflation. They increase fertilizer subsidy burdens for governments, raise manufacturing costs, and reduce household purchasing power. A sustained increase in oil prices spreads across the entire economy like a chain reaction. It slows growth, affects employment generation, and weakens fiscal stability. Therefore, India's energy policy is fundamentally shaped by practical economic considerations rather than ideological positioning. This is a very important point to understand. India's engagement with Russian oil reflects economic realism and national interest, not necessarily political alignment with any geopolitical bloc. Now let us move toward the condition of global oil markets themselves. Global oil markets today are already operating under significant pressure. Conflicts in West Asia, attacks on shipping infrastructure, disruptions in maritime trade routes, and broader geopolitical instability have created an atmosphere of persistent uncertainty. Particularly important are the tensions involving Iran and concerns surrounding the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most critical maritime choke points because nearly 1/5 of global oil trade passes through it. A substantial portion of India's crude oil and liquefied petroleum gas imports also transit through these waters. This makes the region strategically vital for India's energy security. Any instability in this area immediately affects shipping costs, insurance premiums, freight rates, and crude oil prices globally. One of the most fascinating aspects of oil markets is that they react not only to actual supply disruptions, but also to the fear of disruption. Even policy announcements by major powers, such as the United States, can influence market psychology. If traders anticipate tighter sanctions, shipping risks, or supply shortages, prices may rise even before any actual reduction in supply occurs. This demonstrates how deeply sensitive and interconnected global energy markets have become. Oil prices today are shaped not merely by physical supply and demand, but also by geopolitical perceptions, financial expectations, and strategic signaling. Now let us examine the contradictions inherent within Western sanctions policy. The United States and European countries seek to reduce Russian oil revenues in order to weaken Russia economically. At the same time, however, they also want to maintain low inflation and stable fuel prices domestically. But these two objectives often conflict with each other. Why does this contradiction emerge? Because stricter sanctions can tighten global oil supply and push prices higher. Once oil prices rise sufficiently, Russia may continue earning large revenues despite exporting lower quantities of oil. In other words, sanctions can unintentionally increase global prices in ways that partially compensate Russia for reduced export volumes. This contradiction explains why sanctions policies frequently oscillate between aggressive restrictions and pragmatic flexibility. Temporary waivers, exemptions, and carve-outs often emerge because political objectives collide with economic realities. In many ways, market realities force governments to behave pragmatically even when their geopolitical rhetoric remains confrontational. Now, this entire situation also reflects a deeper transformation in the meaning of energy security itself. Traditionally, energy security primarily referred to securing physical access to oil reserves and fuel supplies. But in today's world, energy vulnerabilities extend far beyond physical production. Modern energy systems are deeply connected with shipping routes, insurance mechanisms, financial networks, payment systems, sanctions regulations, tanker availability, and global banking structures. A country may theoretically have access to oil supplies, but sanctions on payments, restrictions on shipping insurance, or tanker blacklisting can still disrupt energy flows. Therefore, energy security today is inseparable from geopolitics and global finance. Oil is no longer just a commodity. It has become a strategic instrument within international power competition. At the same time, despite rapid growth in renewable energy, the global economy still depends overwhelmingly on hydrocarbons. Sectors such as transportation, aviation, petrochemicals, agriculture, and heavy industry continue relying heavily on fossil fuels. There is often significant discussion globally about energy transition and decarbonization. However, the operational reality is that the modern economy still functions primarily through oil and gas. This means that disruptions in hydrocarbon supply continue to carry enormous economic consequences. Now let us focus specifically on India's long-term energy strategy in response to these changing global realities. The first major requirement is diversification. India cannot depend indefinitely on discounted Russian crude during periods of geopolitical crisis. Such arrangements may provide temporary economic relief, but long-term energy security requires a broader and more resilient framework. India, therefore, needs to diversify import sources more aggressively. It must continue expanding strategic petroleum reserves so that temporary disruptions do not immediately destabilize domestic markets. Domestic exploration and production capacities also need strengthening, although India's geological limitations mean imports will continue playing a major role. The second requirement concerns infrastructure strengthening. India must improve refining flexibility so that refineries can process a wider range of crude grades from different regions. Expanding gas infrastructure is also essential because natural gas can partially reduce oil dependence in several sectors. Simultaneously, investments in renewable energy must continue accelerating. Renewable energy alone cannot immediately replace hydrocarbons, but over time, it can reduce vulnerability to imported fossil fuels. Another important aspect involves reducing dependence on vulnerable maritime choke points. Since a large share of India's energy imports pass through strategically sensitive regions, such as the Strait of Hormuz, diversification of routes and suppliers becomes increasingly important for long-term resilience. Now, alongside infrastructure and diversification, India must also preserve what is known as strategic autonomy. The global order is becoming increasingly fragmented. International trade is increasingly shaped by sanctions regimes, geopolitical blocs, technological restrictions, and strategic rivalries. In such an environment, excessive dependence on any single geopolitical bloc creates long-term vulnerabilities. India's approach therefore reflects strategic autonomy rather than passive neutrality. Strategic autonomy means preserving the freedom to make decisions according to national interest rather than external geopolitical pressure. India seeks to maintain balanced relationships with multiple global powers while ensuring that its economic and energy security interests remain protected. This pragmatic approach is particularly important in a fragmented world where geopolitical alignments are becoming increasingly unstable. As we conclude this discussion, we must recognize that the world is entering a period characterized by recurring wars, sanctions, maritime insecurity, trade disruptions, and geopolitical fragmentation. In such an environment, resilience becomes more important than ideology. Energy systems ultimately operate according to physical realities and economic necessities rather than political slogans alone. For India and other developing countries, the central challenge is not merely obtaining cheaper oil. The larger challenge is building a sustainable and resilient energy framework capable of surviving geopolitical shocks, supply disruptions, and market volatility. Ultimately, in the 21st century, national stability and economic strength will increasingly depend on a country's ability to navigate an unstable and fragmented global energy order with strategic flexibility, economic pragmatism, and long-term resilience.